Okay, good evening everyone and welcome to the second annual Fage lecture. Before we begin the lecture, I would like to thank Benedetta Rossi firstly for having the idea of establishing this prestigious annual lecture series, which is part of her bigger mission to raise our profile and give us those opportunities to engage with eminent researchers in the field of African studies. So thank you, Benedetta, for arranging this for us. The lecture tonight will be given by Professor Paul Nugent, who is Director of African Studies at the University of Edinburgh. Paul trained at SOAS in London and wrote his PhD on the small community of Ligpe on the Ghana-Togo border. And I think of Paul as a researcher in the fine area studies tradition. And by this I mean that he started off working on a very particular small place. But doing that doesn't confine one to pointless research. What it does is give you a really strong basis from which to branch out and to comment and analyse a much wider range of themes. And this is what Paul went on to do. His first book has the best title ever. And I would say that this is something that marks Paul's career, is the ability to find really good book titles. So Big Men, Small Boys, Politics in Ghana is a great title. And this remains the best study, I think, of Rawlins Ghana, because it looks at the ways in which ideological starting points are mediated by real-world organisational structures and also by the relationships between individuals who have risen up through different orders of status. The next respect in which Paul used that initial basis to branch out into a wider theme is in the study of ethnicity. And along with Carola Lentz, he was one of the people who really challenged the constructivist view that identities in colonial Africa were largely invented. And he and Carola edited a very influential study called Ethnicity in Ghana, The Limits of Invention, which again challenged people to put those abstract notions of identity and belonging against real-world material concerns. Paul's next book is one of great significance for me because it came out just at the time that I finished my PhD, and it probably took me about a decade before I felt confident that I had anything more to contribute to the subject that Paul had marked out so well. This book also had a brilliant title, which was Smugglers, Secessionists and Loyal Citizens on the Ghana-Togo Frontier. This book established Paul's reputation as the preeminent scholar of African borderlands, and he's since gone on to assist and lead other people in their research on borderlands through the Aborn Research Network and also by editing the African Borderlands series at Palgrave Macmillan. At the moment, Paul is working on two big projects. One is on the South African wine industry, which integrates the issue of race in studying the production and consumption of wine. But we're not going to talk about that much tonight. What we're going to talk about tonight is another major project, which is going to be a book with Cambridge University Press in the very near future. And this project extends his study of border zones, but it does so in two ways. It introduces a comparative dimension between the Trans-Volta area of the Ghana-Togo border and the Senegambia. And it also does something very important, which is to add time depth. It's to reach beyond the colonial period, for which the archival sources are more accessible and easier to work with, and actually push deeper into time back into the mid-18th century. So without further ado, we're over to Paul. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, for those kind words, and to Benedetta for the invitation. Coming up with snappy titles takes almost as long as writing the books themselves, and sometimes, of course, has got me into trouble. The Smugglers and Secessionists book was supposed to be published in Ghana, but it was pulled at the last minute by the Ghanaian publisher, who didn't like the insinuation in the title that the Eves were smugglers and secessionists, whereas in fact the whole point of the book was the opposite. But anyway, it led to the book not being available in Ghana, so I got rather hoist on my own petard, you might say. it's obviously a great honour for me to be invited to deliver the Fage lecture for 2014. I never knew John Fage very well. I was never taught by him, but the historian side of my sort of rather bifurcated academic existence was very much reared on a diet of Fage. Indeed, when I was first appointed to a job at Edinburgh University and inherited Christopher Fyfe's massively sweeping African History 1 course, it was Fage's History of Africa and his Introduction to the History of West Africa that more or less provided my lifeline from one week to the next. In the course of this lecture, I'll have occasion at one point to recall one of Fage's interventions on the societal impact of the transatlantic slave trade. But I'm not aware that Fage ever had any particular interest in historical memory as a topic of research. And I have to say it's also a topic that I've approached somewhat gingerly, nudged onward by a fascination, of course, with the ways in which the past in West Africa refuses to lie down and just be dead history. Now, with borders, of course, all Africa's borders have their own intricate histories and associated memories that go with them. And in my experience, if one asks about the positioning of particular borders, one tends to encounter two stock responses. The first is that it was, quote unquote, the Europeans who divided us without our consent, or, quote unquote again, the border divided the Europeans and not ourselves. But when one probes a little deeper, it's clear that informants don't actually always subscribe to these rather stylized versions of the colonial partition, which probably owe as much to school textbooks and classrooms as to the local context. When one gets down to asking about the idiosyncrasies of borderscapes, such as why border pillars are located in a particular place, a much more richly layered account of boundary-making processes typically ensues, in which the local population are presented as much more than passive spectators in a great game played by the Europeans. Now, it's rewarding enough, I think, to look at this disjuncture, and it's something that I've tried to do. But what I want to do in this presentation is to investigate a little bit more something else, which is the ways in which international borders might affect processes of thinking about history. Now, of course, we know a great deal already about how borders have created a kind of mixture of opportunities and practical constraints. This has almost become a sort of a standard line. And both of these things, of course, are key to making sense of how borders have become internalized. But it's no less important to understand how borders as the ultimate, if you like, spatial ruptures, or as Robert Schumann once put it, the scars of history, how they serve to disrupt and allow for a reassemblage of historical memories. So what follows, I want to trace two different patterns. In the first case, from the Senegambia, I want to show that a history of conversion to Islam almost became unthinkable without the border. And then in the second bit, I want to demonstrate the opposite point, namely that a history of a pre-colonial polity becomes almost unthinkable because of the border. And in either instance, of course, the point I'm trying to make is that borders matter a great deal. Before I get to the substance, and I'm going to get there, I promise, I should explain that I'm drawing on a very familiar distinction between memory and history. Along with Maurice Halbwachs and Paul Connaughton, I think we can agree that while memory resides in individual experience, it only becomes comprehensible once embedded in a wider set of social relations, although, and this is a point for Benedetta perhaps, there may be significant elisions and silences, especially where slavery is involved. Memories can be invested in things that are spatially fixed, such as shrines, buildings, monuments, and indeed border pillars, but they are often reproduced also through an oral medium. And despite Pierre Nora's argument that history and memory are opposites, the demise of the one paving the way for the elaboration of the other, I think considerable heuristic value remains in treating memory as social memory as the foundation upon which history making builds, or history writing builds. Now, memory, of course, is necessarily selective, both individually and socially, and it's patchy, and that's precisely because memory involves a reflexive process. History, of course, was also reflected. The difference resides for me in the fact that it's the purpose of history to, if you like, create sculpted narratives that are linear or less often cyclical, and are above all intended to convince. They have a purpose. Histories don't necessarily assume a written form, and indeed the ones that interest me most, and which I'll talk about today, are actually performative in nature. And here I'm referring to festivals, cross-border festivals, which do very much seek to make clear statements that link the past with some kind of imagined future. Finally, I should say something about the comparison itself, and that's where a map might come in, useful. The Senegambian leg of what I'm talking about involves this area roughly like that, so the western segment of the Casamance region of Senegal and the Gambia. It's a region that is made up of what one could call historic Mandinka towns located along the Atlantic seaboard, as well as other settlements that have been repopulated or emerged more recently, largely as a consequence of inward migration by Jolas from Buluf, so down there, that rough area, Karoninkas from the peninsula and islands of Bliss and Caron, so due south, and Manjagos and to some extent Balantas from Guinea-Bissau. Now, if there's one factor that's had a catalytic effect over time, it is violence. Associated with the operations of the transatlantic slave trade, to be sure, but also greatly exacerbated by a struggle for supremacy between Muslim reformers and non-Islamic rulers in the 19th century, which usually goes under the name of the Soninke Marabout Wars. These are of fundamental importance. Of course, we also had the two world wars that were a spur to particular acts of rebellion and resistance to forced conscription. And then in more recent times, we've had the insurgency in the Casamance launched by the MFDC, which has waxed and waned since the 1990s, but has known moments of particular intensities. Now, the recurrence of this pattern of violence and displacement has repeatedly forced populations to think deeply about the nature of community, as well as the effective bonds that link one settlement with the next. The second case is the Trans-Volta, which, as Kate had mentioned, I've been mining for some time now, and I'm interested in roughly this area here on the two sides of the Ghana-Togo border. And I'm particularly interested in the Ewe-speaking peoples of that area, but also more particularly with the largest of the Adangbe minorities in this area, who are called the Agotime. Now, similarly in this region, we can see some of the ways in which the social fabric has been shaped by a history of violence. The transatlantic slave trade certainly left an indelible imprint, but the episode that is seared into the consciousness of most people in this region is the Ashanti invasion of the Trans-Volta between 1869 and 1871, the memory of which is still very, very close to the surface. The First World War during the First World War, this was a minor theatre. The most important things really happened in the period after the war, with the repartition of German Togo in 1919. By comparison with the Senegambia, the Trans-Volta has experienced much less upheaval, but we should mention, of course, the Lome riots of 1933, so-called, as well as the crackdown by the Eyadema regime in the 1990s, both of which culminated in significant loss of life and a flight of refugees across the border into what is now Ghana. Okay, now let me move on to the substance of what I want to say. Maybe compliment. I start then with the border as a mnemonic device, and I'll explain what I mean about that shortly. Now, the border between Senegal and the Gambia is clearly a border which has a history whose complexity is belied by the disarming simplicity of that straight line that you can see in front of you. At the end of the day, it was indeed the British and the French who divvied up territory, but the partition of this region was also rooted in a power dynamic in which Europeans were not the only players. By the time of the final capitulation of the last Soninke, or animist king. Soninke is not an ethnonym in this case, it's a reference to Mandinkas who were non-Muslim. By the time of the final capitulation in 1875 in Kombo, one Fode Sylla had emerged as the emir at the head of the Muslim cause. And from this point, Kombo, which is the green bit, was nominally or formally a Muslim state with its capital at Gunjur. Now, David Skinner has suggested that it was Fode Sylla's Islamic scholarship and specifically his preaching on the subject of jihad, rather than any military background or acumen, that led to his being invited to lead the Muslim forces. In 1874, Sylla came to an agreement with the British that established a neutral zone between them. And this was a point at which Sylla might have consolidated his state. However, instead of doing that, what Sylla proceeded to do was to embark on fresh military campaigns southwards in Narang and Fonyi Jabankunda, which is obviously now in the Casamance region today. And further to the east, one Fode Kaba was doing something rather similar. In both cases, the pursuit of warfare was given an explicit religious justification. It was said that they were carrying jihad to the remaining Soninke outposts amongst the Mandinka, and in raiding Jola populations, it was fine because as non-believers they were essentially fair game. So there was a kind of religious justification for the raiding and warfare that was conducted. And in the case of Fode Sylla, the war economy followed a very familiar logic. Jola captives were sold as slaves eastwards towards Fuladu in return for horses and guns that enabled Fode Sylla to further augment his military power. Now, the small problem for Fode Sylla was that he was embarking on this push southwards at the very moment when the French were making their own move in the opposite direction. Initially, the Portuguese had staked a kind of very general claim to this area, but hadn't really done much to enforce it. And then in 1886, the Portuguese agreed to renounce their claims and left France with a free hand. So France then starts sort of moving into the areas that you have there and to the south, with a view at this point to carving out an empire. And it was this that ultimately forced the British to respond in some way. The cut price option would have been to simply use Fode Sylla as a proxy and hang on to that area on the basis of Fode Sylla's claims. A more ambitious mode would have been staking an independent claim to parts of Narang and Fonyi Jabankunda in competition with the French. Because of the French threat to his own position, Fode Sylla agreed to put himself under formal protection for British protection, in return for an assurance that the British would not interfere with his religion, and he would also receive a financial stipend. Now, this agreement was one of these sort of dialogues of the deaf, because what Fode Sylla was hoping for was to be left with a free hand to continue his raiding activities due south, whereas the British administrator was justifying it on the opposite grounds, namely that it would, quote-unquote, release the industrious Jolas from their worst persecutors, as well as keeping the French, of course, at bay. Now, the authorities in Bathurst were quite keen to sort of do an arm wrestle with the French, but back in London, the authorities were not so keen and decided that it was better to settle these claims with the French rather than getting involved in a very costly confrontation. So in 1889, as part of a broader settlement of claims, an agreement was signed by the British and the French, and a border that you now basically see there was arrived at, which starts following the Alamein River, or what's called the San Pedro, causing some confusion because nobody knew exactly whether they were the same thing, and then the straight line boundary that you have in front of you. This was followed in standard fashion by the setting up of a boundary commission in 1891, and this is where things started to get rather fraught, because Fode Sylla insisted that the boundary commission should take note of the fact that he had claims in that grey area. This is what he claimed as his own, and in particular he said the area that he claimed extended well beyond Kafountine, so right down quite considerably further south than the notional border. And basically to show willing, the boundary commissioners agreed to visit the site or visit that area, and they came across a nice freshly planted boundary pillar, erected very much in the European style that Fode Sylla had clearly planted, and they found evidence of a military camp. But really, this was not an attempt to take Fode Sylla's claims very seriously, and they then, as it were, headed north and got on with the real business of demarcating the boundary that had previously been agreed. Now, of course, Fode Sylla was greatly put out by this, and it was only a matter of time, really, before the final confrontation occurred. And the final confrontation occurred as a result of French complaints that Fode Sylla was continuing to raid into what they now called their own colonial territory. In 1894, he was eventually captured by the French as he was trying to make good his escape across the Marigot into Boulouf. And if you go to this area today, there is a nice tree, a nice baobab tree, where allegedly this is where Fode Sylla was captured as he was trying to get away. So this is kind of your monument, if you like, in the landscape. Following demarcation, the British and the French then proceeded to lament the fact that the borderlands had been depopulated by decades of warfare and raiding. And in each case, they then set about trying to lure migrants from other areas with offers of easy access to land, on which they might be then invited to cultivate groundnuts. Now, although the Gambia was the annual recipient of large numbers of seasonal migrants, which Kenneth Swindell, of course, has written about in great detail, the greatest number of permanent settlers really came from Boulouf. So these were Jola from the southeast. Now, this migration was something that the French and the British thought highly desirable, but they also thought that this was going to be somewhat problematic in terms of the relationship between Mandinka and Jola. But as I've sought to argue elsewhere, the ethnic boundary between Mandinka and Jola actually became rather soft in very little time at all, despite an insistence by both the British and the French that this relationship was one based on mutual antagonism, or at the very least avoidance. The reality is that as the Jola came to live and work amongst the Mandinka, they converted en masse to Islam and came to share the very same politico-religious spaces. By the outbreak of the Second World War, the vast majority of the Jola in this area had become Muslim. A fact that has prompted a lot of historical reflection about the underlying causalities in this region. Now, within this borderland, conversion is understood locally by Muslims as part of a process that reveals, you might say, some elements of divine intervention, but also a great deal of contingency and choice. And crucially, of course, it also involves a border. Both Mandinka and Jola have constructed a narrative that's radically different to the one that is favoured by the followers of Fode Sylla. For the followers of Fode Sylla, Sylla was above all a religious leader, a holy man, committed to bringing the unbelievers to one true faith. And as evidence, they note that he banned the consumption of alcohol, he posted talibés or followers, acolytes, in the areas he conquered, he founded mosques, and he targeted the pursuit of Soninke religious practices which were non-Muslim. However, local accounts suggest a much greater degree of ambivalence amongst peoples whose ancestors had previously, of course, rejected Islam, but who are overwhelmingly Muslim today. And I think I have a quote. Where's it gone? A quote from the town of Kabadio, where he doesn't get a terribly good write-up. There's a reference to basically forcibly seizing wives, raiding people's food stores, seizing their animals, and generally making a nuisance of themselves in a way that did not seem to conform very much to a sense of appropriate behaviour. But far more subversive is the claim that Fode Sylla actually lacked the spiritual attributes that one would normally associate with a holy man. And this is recounted in terms of his failure ultimately to defeat the last Soninke ruler of Narang, Mansa Kalamar. Now, to cut a long story short, Mansa Kalamar was a Soninke. He derived his spiritual powers from the forest in which he lived. And I think I have a... So, talking about that area there. And according to these accounts, Fode Sylla did everything he possibly could to defeat this Soninke ruler. He launched a frontal assault and was driven away by bees, which is a classic trope. in the Mandinka world. He then resorted to subterfuge, which also failed because Mansa Kalamar was privy to otherworldly knowledge. And then he basically gave up. What he said is, okay, I can't take this area by force or stealth. He then provided a cow as a peace offering, prayed, and then predicted that within 6 generations, the people of Kujube, this town in the forest, would convert to Islam. And hey presto, it happened much quicker than 6 generations. It happened within a matter of decades. Now, this is not credited to Fode Sylla, however. The local version of history is one which says actually Fode Sylla was highly unsuccessful. The person who's attributed, who's given the credit for mass conversion is a Mauritanian Marabout by the name of, where's he gone? Sheikh Mahfoudz. This is a mural of the Sheikh, and you can see he died in 1919. So he died some time ago. Whereas Sylla visited destruction on those he notionally sought to convert, it's argued Mahfoudz was a Muslim scholar from a clerical clan in Mauritania who, in his various travels across West Africa, and he did get around, believe you me, all of that demonstrated that he enjoyed divine protection. But he's particularly remembered for reinscribing the message of Islam as the religion of peace, whereas previously amongst the Jola it had been associated with the opposite of peace, with war. And in that sense, he was aligning himself very much with the tradition of promoting a jihad of the heart rather than of the sword, which is a familiar theme in West African history. Now, for me, one of the interesting things about Sheikh Mahfoudz, there's lots of interesting things about him, but one of them was that he was a quintessential borders man. Whenever he got to choose somewhere to settle, he always went for the most liminal zones where he would enjoy the greatest freedom of action and freedom in particular from European surveillance. And it was just a happy coincidence for him that Europeans had a penchant for using forests to define their own colonial borders, which is why we have that straight line boundary at the edge of the Narang forest. It's the easiest place to draw a border. And that is precisely the place where Sheikh Mahfoudz set up one of his main settlements, in a place called Dar Salami Sharif Kunda. And of course, Dar Salami, the choice of name is not accidental, it's accentuating that Islam is a religion associated with peace. The choice of location was also no accident. By taking command of a location that embodied spiritual danger, and where Fode Sylla had got his comeuppance, Mahfoudz was making a point. And in the process, of course, the last bastion of Soninke resistance to Islam was converted neatly into the hotbed of successful Muslim proselytism. Amongst the people of the borderlands today, it's Mahfoudz who is credited with having brought the Mandinka animists, so-called, and the Jola alike to Islam through a display of spiritual tolerance and gentle persuasion. Now, of course, he didn't live to see the fruits of his labour. As you see, he died in 1919. But he created a religious network that bore considerable fruit in the interwar years. And today, the tomb of Sheikh Mahfoudz is very much a focus for veneration during religious festivals. On the day of his birth, people come from all corners of that bit of the Senegambia to his hometown to pay homage to the great man. Meanwhile, in a different section of the forest, not that far away, we have the remains of the settlement attributed to Mansa Kalamar, the last Soninke ruler of this area. People farm all around it, but the central grove, the sacred grove, is basically untouched, and people do not venture in there. And I've heard some people tell of one person telling me of his father having died as a result of ignoring the injunction not going into the forest. He went in as a matter of curiosity, and within 24 hours he was dead. So people avoid it. I did actually go in and I'm still alive, so maybe it doesn't work with me. So this forest is very much a visual reminder of a time when Islam, of course, was not the dominant religion, when Islam was contesting for support amongst people in this region. While Mahfoudz's strategies helped to inscribe the border in various ways, his religious network, of course, also transcended it. As I've said, people come from the Gambia, they come from other parts of the cosmos. So it provides a focus of unity for Muslims from Kombo, Narang, Fonyu Jabankunda, settlements where people, of course, also have older traditions of migration and settlement. Now, this should be read against the countervailing tendency that emerged or has emerged in the context of the MFDC insurgency in the cosmos. The MFDC was quite smart. It respected the border. It didn't raid across the border into the Gambia. Its soldiers, its fighters did not carry arms in the Gambia. They restricted themselves to the Senegalese side of the border. Already by 1992, the northern front of the MFDC, the northern bit of it, had reached an agreement with the Senegalese authorities, which led essentially to a ceasefire. But it didn't lead to the MFDC rebels going away. They basically went into the forest, into the Narang forest, the very same forest I've been talking about at length, and set themselves up there, and essentially lived a predatory existence, living off the local population. And as I've argued elsewhere, some informants actually have discerned or pointed to a pattern of history repeating itself. Fode Sylla raided people's granaries, he stole their cattle. The argument goes, that's exactly what the MFDC has been doing. They've been behaving in a very similar kind of way. And of course, secreting themselves in the forest is something that has a much longer history to it as well. Whereas the MFDC claimed to have a mission to liberate the Casamance people from Senegalese domination, villagers essentially lived in fear of arbitrary violence meted out by MFDC fighters. And the response to this involved two distinct forms that I've been able to detect. On the one hand, the Mandinka and local Jola, who to some extent blame the Buluf Jola migrants for having attracted the rebels in, they hark back, or have harked back to an earlier history of unity in which the chronology is distinctly fuzzy. This is particularly evident in Fonyi Bankunda, where mutual defence arrangements between villages and towns built upon the idea of there once having been a kingdom of Fonyi Bankunda with a capital located somewhere at Jana, which was on that map which I showed you a moment. Here, the recollection of resistance to Fode Sylla, of course, performs an important symbolic function, while also, of course, underlining the contention that Fonyi Bankunda was never part of Kombo, and in that sense insisting that there was a pre-colonial border which the international border essentially has been laid on top of. At the time of my initial fieldwork, when peace had pretty much been restored, I mean, there were the occasional outbreak of fighting, but most of the rebels had disappeared. A Fonyi Bankunda association was organising a cultural festival that very much played to the theme of peace and a historic unity. But interestingly, this was a festival that stopped at the border. It was basically for Mandinka towns in the Casamance. It didn't involve Mandinkas from across the border in the Gambia. So this border, in some ways, got hardened in a rather counterintuitive way, perhaps. The second example is that of the Karuninka, where Karuninka leaders, self-professed leaders, began increasingly to distance themselves from both their Mandinka and their Jola neighbours. I don't have time to go into this in great detail, but suffice it to say that from the early colonial period, Karuninkas had been coming from the islands in the south northwards to trade and to tap palm wine. That's the only wine you get in the presentation, I'm afraid. And lived amongst their Mandinka hosts, who, as good Muslims by this point, did not, of course, drink palm wine. Over a period of time, a bond often developed between the Mandinka hosts and particular Karuninka families, and as more time elapsed, Karuninkas began to settle in great numbers, or considerable numbers, in this border space. They were the very last to convert to Islam. It's only in the last few decades, really, that Karuninkas have become Muslim in any great numbers. But when they did adopt Islam, they typically also changed their ethnic identity. So they adopted Mandinka names and essentially became Mandinka. So that Karuninkas, beyond a couple of generations, it's no longer clear that they're Karuninkas at all. Until the point when there was a backlash, and the backlash came with the insistence by a newly educated Karuninka elite that this was a really wrong way to go, that Karuninkas could be both Muslims and Karuninkas. There's no reason why adopting Islam meant that you had to abandon your identity. So they established an association called Kayon Kalon, which seeks to distill and disseminate elements of Karuninka culture that they regard as positive, while of course stripping out those bits that they regard as backward. Now, distancing the Karuninka from the Mandinka category is an imperative, but the real target has been the Buluf Jola, who they insist are entirely unrelated to them, flying in the face, of course, of colonial ethnographies that have always proclaimed the opposite, which have always said the Karuninkas are basically a type of Jola. They are arguing that Karaninkas have nothing to do with the Jola at all, and if there is any relationship, it's a relationship based on mistrust rather than having anything in common. Now, as with the Mandinka case, you can argue that this is part of an effort to dissociate oneself from the MFDC and its presumed Jola orientation, while at the same time, of course, staking a claim to being fully Gambian, despite the fact that your origins are located well to the south of the border. But perhaps the most interesting point for comparative purposes is that while Kayon Kolon was founded originally on the Casamance side of the border, it only now operates in the Gambia. So they have a cultural festival that takes place every year. It rotates between Gambian towns which have significant Karaninka populations, but it stops at the border. It doesn't involve any great numbers of people coming from the Casamance. So a bit like the Fonyi Jabankunda Association, what we have is a kind of instrumentalization or internalization, perhaps is a better word, of the international border, and a failure really of cross-border festivals to develop in a way that transcends or erases the border. The difference between Kayon Kolon and the Fonyi Jabankunda Association is that Kayon Kolon has very little interest in the history of Islam or the mechanisms by which the border was arrived at. Its orientation is almost completely in the present tense. I mean, it's presentist in every kind of way. Its only real historical claim is that the Karaninka had once upon a time occupied the territories currently inhabited by the Mandinka before they continued their migrations southwards. But even this claim is sort of put forward rather tentatively, because of course it opens the door to the claim, which is very often made, that actually the Mandinka and the Karaninka are the same people. They have a common history, it's just that they got separated at some point in the past. And if you're trying to, as it were, separate yourself out from the Mandinka category, that doesn't help you very much. So even that is rather muted. Okay, let me leave the Senegambia on one side. And how am I doing? Okay, good. Let me move to the second case study, where I think you can see a broadly similar set of processes unfolding. In the 19th century, I might need to go back to our map again. Oh, let's move that one. In the 19th century, the mostly Ewe-speaking polities and these Adangbe minorities lying to the east of the Volta River had remitted a tribute to Ashanti, or Asante, but this was very much mediated by Akwamu, which was a separate political entity which, as it were, was subcontracted to do the dirty work. This relationship broke down in the 1830s, following which, according to Lynn Bryden, the Trans-Volta experienced a period of considerable prosperity. That, however, ended in 1869 when, as I say, Asante armies crossed the Volta and spent 2 years basically laying waste to this land, destroying whole communities and taking back large numbers of slaves to Kumasi. Whereas the majority of chiefdoms capitulated or scattered in various ways, the peoples of Ho and Agotime fought a protracted military campaign, which was essentially a guerrilla campaign, which brought very few, probably no, outright victories on the battlefield, but did expose the supply lines of the Asante occupying army. When the Asante eventually got tired and withdrew, this was followed, of course, in very close order by the British invasion of Ashanti in 1874, and that led to a considerable implosion of Asante dominance within the sub-region. And this, of course, opened up all kinds of possibilities. Asante's loss of the trade routes down the Volta River made possible new kinds of trade using a land route to the east, which benefited a number of people, including the Agotimes. There was also a settling of scores between those Ewe Dukowo, the chieftains that had collaborated, in inverted commas, with the Asante versus those who had fought them. And this involved quite a lot of bloodshed and enslavement. The ones that I should mention perhaps are the Adaklu, who I'll come to in a moment, who are the immediate neighbours of the Agotimes. Now, of course, the Agotimes had been fighting the Asante. The Adaklu were accused of having essentially drawn the Asante to them, and as collaborators, they then became, as it were, stark enemies. The Agotime acquired many slaves at this point in time. Now, the British authorities had sort of acquired Danish claims to a sphere of influence in this area, but in London there was no desire to really act on that. There may have been, amongst the local authorities, a desire to sort of stake claims, but in London, as elsewhere at this point, there was an extreme reluctance to get sucked into anything more than possession of the small coastal strip, which became part of the Gold Coast colony in 1874. As in the case of the Senegambia, however, it was the emergence of a rival European power, in this case Germany, which forced the British into a forward policy. And as in the case of the Casamance, you see a sort of frantic effort to go around signing treaties left, right and centre with anybody who you think represents political authority in a given area in order to use those claims against your rivals, as I say, in this case, Germany and Britain, respectively. And as in the case of the Senegambia, the metropolitan authorities decided to come to a deal, and in 1890 the contested claims were settled as part of the Heligoland Agreement, which then led to a border which followed the left bank of the Volta River. That was now the border between German Togo and the Gold Coast. So it's sort of located well to the west of this map. And that was the border, and this meant that most of the Ewe as well as the Agotimes were in German territory. And then after the First World War, of course, imperial swap shop led to a redrawing of this particular border to take account of French demands that they should have full control of the port at Lomé and the railways. That was what they wanted. Now, amongst the local administration in the Gold Coast, there was a keen desire to avoid partitioning people as a result of this imperial swap shop, and a lot of attention focused on the Agotimes. The problem for the Agotimes is that their easternmost settlements bordered onto the Lomé-Palemé railway. So from the French point of view, they had to have them. The British government's perspective was that there was no easy way out. Either the whole of Agotime would have to be ceded to France, which would mean basically giving up territory on the part of the British, or it would have to be divided in two. Now, the easiest way of doing it, of drawing a border, would have been to follow the River Toji. Nice, not much of a river, but it is a river. And if you had done that, or if they had done that, you would have ended up with only one settlement, Afegame, on the British side, and all the other Agotimes on the French side. And that would have been a pretty good, okay deal. Today, most Agotime people you speak to insist that they were never consulted when this was happening, that this was the deal eventually that was done by the Europeans. In fact, the archival record suggests that the head chief in Petwe was indeed asked what he wanted to do. Did he want to go to the British side, or did he want to go to the French side? And ultimately decided to go to the British side. And the reason that is given is essentially the low opinion that the Agotimes, or at least those in Petwe, had of the French. Indeed, such was the strength of feeling that the war chief, Nene Agbovio I, who I'll come to in a moment, actually abandoned his hamlet in a place called Batume, which actually does appear on that map, and scarped back across the border to Petwe, which was where he had originally come from, rather than be placed under French rule. Predictably, the agreement on this border was followed by a boundary commission, and the boundary commission basically led to the construction of a border which departed from the Toji River and brought three towns, Afegame, Petwe and Adedome, within British Togoland, while leaving the rest of the Agotimes squarely in French territories. Now, some important practical consequences followed from this. The French were absolutely adamant that the head chief in Petwe would cease to exercise any political influence on their side of the border. To add insult to injury, the French subsequently subdivided their portion of Agotime into between two different cantons. So, in fact, on the French side of the border, the Agotimes were not even inhabiting the same administrative space. They were split for a second time. On the British side of the border, the authorities recognized their segment of Agotime as a single unit, but proceeded to place it beneath the Ho Paramount Chief in accordance with the amalgamation policy that was almost a kind of an obsession of the British in the 30s and 40s. So during the colonial era, Agotime essentially ceased to exist. It was in two different colonies, and it was divided in Togo between two different administrative units. And if you look at the maps, Agotime almost disappears. I mean, it used to be sort of Agotime, and then you look at the French maps, you look at the British maps, and it's if it's there at all, it's sort of written in very small font. I think this is telling you something rather important. Practical impediments were placed in the way of any collective celebrations or commemorations of Agotime-ness beyond the everyday run of funerals and marriages. And if anything, after independence, the barriers became even more formidable because the border was repeatedly closed through the 60s, 70s and 80s as a result of tensions between the Ghanaian authorities and their Togolese counterparts. And on both sides, governments were acutely suspicious of any contact between chiefs across the border. Nene Ketaku, who is notionally the head chief of the Agotime today, once described to me being arrested having gone to Togo because he was suspected of not just of having communed with his chiefs on the other side, but having been involved in some kind of secessionist plot. So it became really awkward for people to engage on anything other than a kind of attending a funeral, but doing anything more than that was to put your head above the parapet. So this was another reason why Agotime essentially died as an idea in the period after independence. So how did the border come between the Agotimes and their history? Well, as in the Senegambia, there's a larger context, of course, that shaped the imperative to take the past seriously. Since the late 1950s, the Agotimes have been engaged in a series of protracted land disputes with their Ewe neighbours, and most particularly with the Adaklu, who I referred to a moment ago. The antagonism between the Adaklus and the Agotimes certainly goes back to the Asante invasion, and it probably goes back much further. The Adaklu case rests on the contention that the Agotimes are strangers, which might sound rather strange if they arrived here in the late 17th century, but as far as the Adaklus are concerned, that doesn't matter. They're still strangers who were granted land on which to settle, and subsequently, so the argument goes, they abused their hospitality. The Agotimes, on the other hand, say, yes, of course, we got here later than you people, but we seized the land by force, by military force. That is what justifies our right to be here. A decade ago, this legal dispute was overlaid by an equally bitter wrangle over the siting of a newly created capital, or a capital for a newly created Adaklu Anyigbe district. The Adaklus again insisted that they were the landlords and therefore they should have the district capital. The Agotimes insisted that they were the historically top dog and therefore they should have the capital, and it got mixed up with the electoral politics around about 2004 as well, just to complicate matters even further. Now, amidst the welter of conflicting information that came before the courts in the land case, this is inside Ghana, one thing is strikingly obvious. The Adaklu had an internally coherent historical narrative that was supported in most respects by witnesses coming from the other Ewe chiefdoms on both sides of the border. On the other hand, the Agotime struggled to present a coherent account of their own history. It was all over the place. Now, I don't think this is a deficiency of the legal team. In fact, the head of the chambers and the person who was leading the Agotime case was a former head of the Ghana Bar Association, so he was a pretty good lawyer by all accounts. The problem really lies in the fact that having been divided in multiple ways since 1919, the Agotime had almost no occasion to distill the fragments of memory into something that cohered as history. For many Agotimes, the existence of the border is a constant reminder of the fact that there was once a single political entity that ceased to exist almost a century ago. On the Ghana side, where there is this strong sense of being embattled with the neighbours, there has been an incentive to try and reconnect with Agotimes in Togo. And it's in this context that the idea of a cross-border festival has come to life. These days, Obama Voisin, or the Kente Weaving Festival, is staged in the first week of September. It hasn't always happened, and this rather patchy record illustrates some of the ways in which the border has served to perpetuate a fracturing of historical memory. Now, at the risk of systematizing that which is inherently unsystematic, one might say that there are three variants of Agotime social memory that sometimes collide with one another, but more typically kind of revolve in their own orbits and never necessarily meet each other. In Athegame, the preferred version of the past is very much about a story of migration. It's a story about how the Agotimes came from the coastline around Ada, so a bit further down there, how they migrated from one place to the next, and then eventually found a place to settle amongst the palm trees, or the fan palm trees, which is where they get their ethnonym from, Agotime, amongst the Agoti palm trees. This is an account that privileges Afegame as the nucleus and the keeper of the male and female stools that the Agotime supposedly brought with them from Ada. It's worth noting that this movement, or a movement, of a number of Adangbe subgroups, both eastwards and northwards, is actually borne out quite well from the Danish records of the late 17th century. I don't have time to go into this, but believe me, there is some interesting stuff there. A second version places greater emphasis upon the Agotime as a loose coalition of Adangbe-speaking peoples who did indeed establish the right to settle by military force, but created towns that were, to all intents and purposes, autonomous from one another. And again, if one goes to the historical record, it's kind of interesting. This is a map, a Danish map, Tonning's map of 1802. And on it, if you could actually blow it up enough, you would see that in this area here, there are 4 Agotime towns specifically identified. Nitwe, Zukpe, a place that is presumably Apagame, Petwe, and Adedome. Have I got 4? That should be 5. Sorry, 5 towns. I'll leave that on one side for a moment. Oh, actually, I should point out that there are multiple versions of this map. This is a rather more colourful version of the same thing, again depicting Agotime settlements at this point in time in the early 19th century. The third variant can be seen as an extension of the second, but asserts the primacy of Petwe as the capital that thrived on the basis of militarism and trade towards the coast. And again, the archival record, the Danish archival record, is quite instructive on this, because it does indeed point to traders from Petwe who are named, providing slaves to coastal towns, Anglo-coastal towns, and developing quite close relationships with people down at the coast. Isert in the mid to late 18th century is one of the people who comments specifically on the Agotimes bringing slaves down to the coast, and a number of the other sources at this time also refer to the creation of quite close bonds between particular Anglo settlements and families and their Agotime counterparts. According to this version, there was an Agotime state that had a capital at Petwe, although quite how it functioned is a matter of some contestation. And within Petwe itself, there's always been a bit of a fight over this issue because, well, it was all brought into relief by the Asante invasion I referred to earlier on. The current Agotime head chief has an interest in claiming a much longer lineage to his chiefdom, or his paramountcy, as he would prefer to put it. But the dominant opinion is that the Agotimes never had a king. That was an invention of the Germans. All they had was big men who prospered through the pursuit of trade and warfare, which went very closely together with one another. By common agreement, there was an Avapia, or a war chief, by the name of Akoto at the point when the Ashantis invaded. It's also agreed that Akoto invited Agbovi I, or who becomes Agbovi I, to take control of the campaign against Ashanti, presumably when things were going rather badly. These days, the Akoto and Agbovi families don't see eye to eye on quite what happened, on whether they agreed to share power or whether Agbovi became the overall leader. But they do agree that all the Agotimes fought under the direction of Petwe. Now, of course, this is a view that privileges the capital, whereas in the outlying settlements, including those in Togo, there's no great enthusiasm in buying into this story because it essentially downgrades their importance. So in a place like Zukpe, which appears on that 1802 map, they insist that they were not fighting under Petwe at all. They were essentially autonomous. In a controversial article, I think it's still controversial, John Fage once concluded that, quote unquote, the operation of the slave trade may have tended to integrate, strengthen, and develop unitary territorial political authority, but to weaken or destroy more segmentary societies. So more centralized societies got more centralized, and the segmentary societies got more disorganized. In Lynn Bryden's recent account of the collapse of polities in the face of the Asante invasion, we might see some support for the former position, but Agotime seems to point, I think, to another possibility. I think personally that there was no such thing as an Agotime kingdom, and it's doubtful that there was ever even a state in the commonly understood sense of that term. In all likelihood, Agotime was a loose coalition of related towns that came together as and when the need arose. And they had powerful friends. The Akwamu, if the Akwamu were essentially the intermediaries of Asante, the Agotimes were the right-hand men of the Akwamu and benefited from that relationship. It's possible that there was a priest at Afegame, but the real big men emerged in Petwe because of its favourable location in relation to the north-south trade routes. And when those trade routes moved eastwards after the defeat of Asante in 1874, this benefited Petwe even further. It also led to the attraction of Anglo settlers from the coast who came there to trade. And my strong suspicion, although I've never been able to verify this, is that they were building on these much older links between Agotime and particular coastal settlements during the heyday of the slave trade. What happened is that those marital bonds were quite strong, and many of the Anglo simply relocated northwards to live in Petwe and to become essentially culturally Agotime. Today they are regarded as Agotime. Success or leadership does seem to have been based on success in warfare and trade rather than claims to first settlement or depth of lineage and all that kind of stuff. A successful big man was someone who accumulated dependents and above all slaves, as Agbovi I certainly did in the wake of the Asante invasion, because he settled his slaves at the town I mentioned earlier called Batume. I was recently, this was in the last month, asked by a chief in Petwe if there was a map that depicted the boundaries of the kingdom of Agotime as it had once been. He was desperate to see it marked out. And I had to disappoint him. I said, well, there are these Danish ones. There are these Danish ones, but really all they do is show towns. They don't show territory. And that, of course, wasn't really of much interest to him, although he was interested. It was a very old map, but it didn't really satisfy his desire for a thing with sharply defined borders. The closest we get to a map which shows closely demarcated borders is the German Charta from Togo of 1902 or 5, I can't remember which, 1902 I think, in which the sections that cover Agotime are divided between two sheets. It always seems that the Agotime are on the wrong side of cartography, even Google Maps. You can't get a map of Agotime. The sheets don't line up on Google Maps for some strange reason. And the German maps do exactly the same thing. It's really annoying. So if you were able to increase this, which I don't think we can, sufficiently, you would have in fairly large writing down here the term Agotime. And if you go to the next sheet, which is this one, you have exactly the same thing over here. If you stick those two bits together, it's actually a whopping great area in comparative terms. Let me see if I can go back to my original. So, on the German maps, Agotime basically runs something like that, almost up to Palimene and then down to the railway. It's a huge area. Well, comparatively, it's a huge area in a place which is typified by rather smaller political entities. So this is kind of really interesting, and I think this is the sort of thing that would be of interest to the chief who was asking me if I knew of any maps. However, I would again feel the need to disappoint him, because I think that the German map probably reflects something important, which is the success with which Agotime towns imposed tributary relationships on their Ewe-speaking neighbours, rather than indicating the territorial limits of the state. I don't think that, as impressive as it looks, is depicting a territorially bounded pre-colonial kingdom, or by this point, a colonial kingdom. Okay, now, in my last minutes, let me turn to Agbomovosa itself in order to get at some of the ways in which the border might have impeded the elaboration of a shared history. In 1978, the idea of a cross-border festival actually started on the Togo side, and it was called Abakeza, which is best translated as the festival to celebrate the ending of war. It was first held at the Togolese town of Zukpe. Then it was held at the Togolese town that skirts the railway, Amuzukope, in 1981. And then it was supposed to go to Ghana. So it was supposed to finally cross the border. Unfortunately, at this time, the Rawlings Revolution happened. The border was closed, there was curfews, there was a lot of tension along this border, and the third version never happened. And then the relationship between Ghana and Togo was so tense, it was impossible to have any kind of festival across the border. Until the mid-1990s, when again it seemed like something could be done. And at this point, Nene Keteku, the head chief, decided to reactivate it, but with a difference, which is that it would have Petwe as the capital right at the center of the festival. The other crucial difference was that it wouldn't be about war, or the ending of war, Abakeza. It would be about Agbamavoza, it would be about celebrating a culture of kente weaving. Now, the reason for that change is that some thought it was inappropriate to dwell on Agotime military victories and pursuits when so many people had servile origins. I've referred to the town of Batume, which is populated by the slaves that Agbovi I had taken. But even in Petwe itself, there are clans which, by all accounts, are the legacies of the enslavement of other people at particular moments in time. So it's a rather sensitive issue to be banging on about warfare when there are some people, at least, who are on the receiving end of that story. So it was thought much better to take something safe, like kente weaving, and it's a nice living tradition, it has cultural authenticity, to build upon that. So what we have today is a festival that goes on for a week, and it involves a series of rather delicate balancing acts which play themselves out over previous days. In previous years, or at least the times that I've been to it, day one involved this thing, the firing of musketry. Not in Petwe, but in one of the other towns, which you can see as a celebration of Agotime militarism. And it's all acted out. The Agotimes, they're scouting and they're firing, and then it all ends with the laying down of arms. So it celebrates warfare, but then also celebrates peace at the end of that process. And of course, everyone is wearing red, which is the color of mourning, which further underlines the point. In 2013, it started differently. It started with the reenactment of the discovery of Apegame as the notional first settlement, which was an attempt to get the Apegame people to buy into this whole thing. And then in other days, different things happen. There's young women compete in a beauty competition. Older women, usually including the Member of Parliament, carry water from the Toje River which has some other symbolic meaning. And then, of course, you've got the Kente weaving competition, which is at the centre of everything, or should be at the centre of everything. And as of 2013, the winner is carried aloft on some kind of a plinth. That's another innovation. And then the festival always ends with a grand durbar in the grounds of the Customs and Excise Preventive Service Training Centre. They have lots of seats there. And this is an occasion to which political dignitaries, of course, are invited, regional ministers, politicians from the capital city. At this event, everybody, of course, sheds their red cloth and they wear their kente. And Nene Keteku, as the notional paramount chief of the Agotimes, as it were, sits in state. Now, if you looked at this at first sight, you might think, well, he's, of course, the star of the occasion. But in fact, he's not. He turns up in a car, is dropped off, and he sits on a seat, and that's the last you see of him. The two people who are at the centre of this festival are the war chiefs, who I referred to earlier on, Akoto and Agbovi, who are the only people who are allowed to travel in a palanquin. And this is something which people fight like mad over. The fact that they are the historic war chiefs from the time of the Asante invasion, they are the only people who get the right to be carried like this. And of course, they are the real stars of the show. They are the people that the crowds kind of flock to. So here again, we have militarism sort of built in at the same time as the Grand Durbar is celebrating proficiency in the weaving of the most elegant kente cloth. All of that balances the claim to the existence of a single paramountcy with the insistence that it was the war chiefs who ensured that Agotime could exist in the first place. All of it takes place in the full view of the Ghanaian national media, The television station is always there filming. And it provides, of course, an occasion when messages can be relayed to the politicians in Accra and in Ho. But, and I am coming to the end very quickly, very soon, this is a festival that's really struggled to win universal acceptance. In most years, only one Togo chief has come, and he's the one from Batume, which has this special relationship. And even he is boycotted at particular moments. In general, the Togolese stay away, and the reasons for this are several. There's some resentment at the fact that Petwe has monopolized it, whereas people in Zukbe will say, well, look, we were of equal status in the past, so that old story comes back. The other problem is that the chief in Zukbe and one other have been elevated to canton chiefs in their own right, so they're the equivalent of a Ghanaian paramount chief. There's a real problem for them coming to a festival in which they are, in a sense, downgraded in the traditional pecking order. And there's an additional problem, which is that in the Ghanaian political scene, the Agotime head chief is not actually considered a paramount chief at all. He's a sub-chief to the Asogli state, or within the Asogli state. So you have the sub-chiefs becoming paramount chiefs, and the paramount chief notionally becoming a sub-chief. The possibility for all kinds of horrible things to happen are very great. So the Togolese, on the whole, have tended to just stay away from the festival altogether. But another reason, of course, has to do with Kente itself. When I once asked a Togolese participant why so few of his people bothered to turn up, he said, well, putting on cloth's a Ghanaian thing. We don't wear cloth in Togo very often. And I thought, what? And then I realised what he said was quite true. If you go to church on the Togolese side of the border, you don't see people wearing Kente cloth. You see weaving taking place on the Ghana side of the border. Go 1 or 2 kilometres into Togo, nobody's weaving. So there's something rather interesting here about the way in which the border has created a quite different set of cultural constructs, which gets in the way, of course, of celebrating notionally what you have in common. After some years in which the festival was boycotted by various... oops, I've lost my thing now. It was boycotted in 2013. Things seemed to come together. The Afegame chief took part for the first time and probably the last time. The firing of musketry took place in Zukbe, so the Togolese canton chief was on board as well. There's been some success in raising external sponsorship. It's now not only Star Lager that supports it, but there are others involved, including the Mormons for some reason. I've not quite understood what that one's all about. Actually, the Mormon involvement's quite funny because they paid for the printing of the posters and misspelt all the names. But anyway. So there is a feeling that maybe this thing's finally starting to come together. But this can't disguise the fact that while the Agotimes generally feel that they should celebrate their unique history and culture, they still disagree fundamentally about what it is that they are celebrating. The border has got in the way because traditional systems of authority, consumption patterns have followed quite divergent paths. Okay, in conclusion, let me try and draw the threads together. And it's probably best to do this with reference to the relationship between space and time, which I haven't made all that explicit until now. Borderland studies is typically focused on borders as physical markers that produce certain social, economic, and political effects. And the temporal dimension is typically confined to a discussion of key moments, such as when the border was demarcated or when the border was moved. And it's some of that which I've addressed in this talk. But there's more to borders than this would imply. Although they are fixed in space, they are often implicated in a game of free association when it comes to history. And what I mean by that is something rather paradoxical. The work of producing history is ultimately forward-looking. The quest for a narrative backbone often means that the effect of today's borders are backdated to a period before they actually existed. So borders actually help to reconfigure history relating to a point when they didn't actually exist, if you can get my drift. I'll just say what I mean about that in a second. In the case of Agotime, I think we have a fairly straightforward instance where the border doesn't merely impose a physical obstacle to the movement of people and goods, but also to the free flow of ideas. Social memory is reproduced at the level of the household and the lineage and is much less affected. History, in the sense that I'm using it, can be produced at any level, but its reception and its reproduction requires access to public spaces, and it's precisely those public spaces that were closed down with the partition of 1919, the subsequent segmentation of the Agotimes, and the repeated closure of the international border. And it's precisely this impediment which Agbamavoza, as a space in which history is actively being created, seeks to overcome. Now, of course, when Agotimes cross the border, they're daily reminded of the fact that there was something there. There was an Agotimeness that is no more. But they find it very difficult to imagine exactly what it was that was given up, what it was that was sundered by the creation of the border in 1919. In a sense, the border creates a historical itch that can never really properly be scratched. Now, in the case of the Senegambia, we have a more complex story where the border is mnemonically linked to history making that addresses the conversion of the Jola and the Mandinka to Islam in the late 19th century. But what is striking is that the existence of a clearly defined border between Kombo, Narang, and Fonyi Jabankunda has been read backwards into a much more distant past, partly through the creation of a counter-narrative to the heroics of Fode Sylla. And in the process, the international border has been legitimated because the claim is that the international border is the same as an existing, much older border that was there before the Europeans arrived. Although the border is routinely crossed, it's also inscribed through festivals that don't, in practice, cross the border. And while the Mahfoudz religious network does connect people in the Gambia and the Casamance, my favourite Mauritanian Marabout deliberately selected the forested border zone as his base. The image of Mahfoudz is therefore as crucial to the history of the making of the border as it is to the history of Islam in this part of West Africa. And on that point, I will end. Thank you.